Well, good morning, friends. I am Pastor Michelle, and this is my sermon for Sunday, September 14th. I don't know where my mind was, thinking it was June, but we are in the month of September. So I am with Harmony Creek Church, a church that throws open their doors widely and invites and celebrates and loves and embraces everyone that walks through our door. And so this Sunday, I am preaching on the parable of the lost sheep. And so I thought we'd begin with the scripture reading from Luke 15. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him being Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. "Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulder and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost.'" Now, just some context. This comes in light, this particular chapter of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. The writer of Luke gives three parables that Jesus gives. They're all around this lost and found theme. So we have the parable of the lost sheep. We have the parable of the lost coin, where the woman searches her whole house for this lost coin and finds it and celebrates. And then we have the famous parable of the lost son, which is also known as parable of the prodigal son. The story of the father who gives away his inheritance early to his son. His son goes and blows it and spends all of it and wastes it away. And then the son has to come back and back home, and the father welcomes him with open arms. It's a really, really good story. But for today, I want to focus on the parable of the lost sheep. And so let's begin, shall we? Where am I? Am I lost? How many of us have asked these questions at one point or another in our lives? I know I have. And I would say I have mastered the art of getting lost, because I can even get lost while using GPS, which I feel is a real talent. And let's just be transparent here. Never, ever rely on me to get you somewhere if we're walking, like using the GPS directions for walking. Because that is my deep struggle. Getting lost is an art. I feel like it is an art. And there's that bumper sticker that you see sometimes that says, "All who wander are not lost," or something like that. But more than likely, if I'm wandering, I'm lost. But think about all that. When reading the parable of the lost sheep, right, I find myself really relating to the one sheep that's lost its way. Perhaps this one sheep thought to themselves, "Where am I? Where are my 99 other friends?" So in our reading, and Jesus gives this parable. Let's think about the context. Jesus gives this parable, he in response to the leaders of the day. We find Jesus hanging out with whom others consider to be the wrong crowd, and the Pharisees weren't happy about it. A lot of things that Jesus did, the people in power were not happy about. So just hear these words from Reverend Christopher A. Henry. He says, at issue are Jesus' eating habits, specifically with whom he chooses to share the table. The picture in my mind is the middle school cafeteria. Jesus is that child who is inviting the wrong people to sit next to him, ignoring the great truth of adolescence that you are judged by the company you keep. Jesus is spending time with precisely the wrong people if he wants to be recognized as an upright, religious, pure authority figure. Not only is he welcoming them to his table, but he's also eating with them, eating with the sinners. End quote. So in other words, as I said last week, Jesus wasn't afraid to have friends in low places. He wasn't afraid to hang out with those whom society had rejected or deemed unworthy for whatever reason. Jesus wasn't afraid to love the unlovable and wasn't afraid to see the invisible. And as we said, not everyone liked the way that Jesus chose to live and love. So he responds to the criticism from the Pharisees by telling them some parables. And all the parables, as I said in this chapter, and Luke dealt with the lost and found theme. Jewish scholar Amy Jill Levine reminds us that parables are often seen as a hallmark of Jesus' teaching. As it says in Mark, with many such parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He didn't speak to them except in parables, but Jesus explained everything in private to his disciples. So a few of these private explanations have been preserved. The crowds then, only a few of these have been preserved, right? The crowds then, the readers, the listeners, need to find their own understanding, and we too must find ours. The gospel writers left most of the parables as open narratives in order to invite us into engagement with them. Each reader will hear a distinct message and may find that same parable leaves multiple impressions over time. End quote. And I see that as certainly the truth. Because let's think about the parable of the lost sheep. What are some ways that you have understood this parable? How is it speaking to you today as you hear it? And I know that I can't hear your responses. But if you want to type in on a comment, you can. One way that people have come to understand this parable, and the way that I understood it as a child, is to talk about how it points to the fact that we as human beings are sinners who have lost our way, and we need to be found by God. It says in Isaiah 53:6 that we're all lost. We're all like lost sheep who have gone astray. This theology, this understanding that we're all lost sheep who are no longer part of the fold of God, who are not part of the fold of God, was something that was ingrained in me from a very young age. I was told we were lost and we need to be found by God. I was the lost sheep who had strayed from the rest of the sheep. And if I didn't find my way back to the rest of the flock, then there would be dire consequences. But over the years, I have definitely come to understand this parable differently. Thinking about the context of this parable and why Jesus was sharing, I want us to think about the context of this parable and why Jesus was sharing this story to begin with. This is how I'm going to share my understanding of the parable. So as we talked about, Jesus was hanging out with the sinners, with the outcasts, with the misfits, with the rejected. Those were his people. When Jesus tells these parables, when Jesus tells these lost and found parables, specifically, let's focus on the lost sheep. When he tells this parable, he was addressing the leaders who resented his fellowship with the sinners and the outcasts. He was addressing the people who stood in judgment over his many friends in low places. He was pointing out that all sheep mattered, even the ones who might have lost their way a bit. Jesus, I think, was constantly pointing to God's love, especially God's love for those on the margins. So for me, I don't think this parable is about the lost sheep representing a lost soul who has wandered away from God and needs saving. Because the thing is, if we think about this text, the so-called lost sheep, I believe, has belonged to the shepherd's flock from the very beginning. Just because the sheep may have gotten distracted and gotten a little turned around didn't mean that the sheep was no longer part of the shepherd's flock. I think that's an important distinction because growing up, it was always like the sheep is the black sheep. The sheep goes away from the other sheep and so therefore is not part of the flock anymore. But the truth is, all 100 of these sheep were important to the shepherd. And that's why the shepherd was willing to go out on a limb to bring back the one that wandered off. His flock would have been incomplete without that one sheep. And it's important to point out, I think, that good shepherds didn't always work alone. This shepherd was a good shepherd, I think, right? Because he cared about all the sheep. And this shepherd would have probably had an assistant shepherd or an under shepherd. So that under shepherd would have been able to watch over the 99 others while the shepherd, the main one, went after the one that wandered away. And I see this as a demonstration of that all sheep matter. All sheep matter. So when I think about this parable of the lost sheep, I believe this story isn't about being lost, but it's about being found. Maybe a better title would be Parable of the Found Sheep. I believe it's about coming to understand that we have always been found, even if we identify with the lost sheep and we feel like we've wandered off the main course. And we might feel a bit turned around. Even then though, we're still God's beloved. We're still part of God's flock. Nothing will ever change that part of our identity. Yes, there may be times we get turned around. Yes, there may be times we get literally lost. But we are never lost from God and God's love. We will always be found. And speaking of that always be found, I want to talk about one of my favorite musicals, Dear Evan Hansen, which is about a socially anxious high school student named Evan Hansen. He feels invisible and he struggles to connect with others. So after a classmate, Connor Murphy, dies by suicide, a misunderstanding leads Connor's family to believe that Evan was Connor's closest friend. Instead of correcting them, Evan goes along with the lie, partly out of fear, but mostly out of his deep longing to belong. As the story unfolds, Evan is embraced by Connor's family. He gains popularity at school and even begins a relationship with Zoe, Connor's sister. And in the midst of all this, Evan helps spark a movement called the Connor Project, which inspires people to reach out, share their struggles, and remind one another that no one is truly alone, that everyone can be found. But the thing is, as the lie grows, so does Evan's guilt. Eventually, the truth comes out, hurting those around him and forcing Evan to face his own loneliness and mistakes. But in the end, even in the midst of that, this musical is less about the deception and more about the universal need to be seen, heard, and loved. It highlights themes of mental health, grief, forgiveness, and the hope that even in our darkest moments, even when we feel the most lost, we can be found. We are found. I love one of the songs from the musical called You Will Be Found. This beautiful song is a reminder that no matter how lost or invisible we may feel, there is a place where we belong. In Evan's mistakes, his longing, and even his lies, we see a very human truth, that deep down all of us want to be known and loved. All of us want to be found. And Scripture even echoes this longing. In Psalm 139, one of my favorite Psalms, we hear, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. Where can I go from your spirit? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." So even in our darkest places, even when we feel unseen, even when we feel completely lost, God is present. God finds us. God will always find us. Because the truth is, we're never truly lost. Not from God. Not from our belovedness. We are always, always found. And I think about this song, You Will Be Found. And I think about here at Harmony Creek Church. You know, however you find yourself in this moment of life, perhaps you find yourself having it all together. Perhaps you find yourself not having it together and your life is just a big old mess. Perhaps you find yourself not feeling like you're doing enough to make the world a better place. However and wherever you find yourself, just know you are found. You are found and you are loved for exactly who you are. And nothing can take that away from you. We are God's beloved through and through. So remember that, because that is the message for me that I want to repeat week after week. That is, for me, the most important message that I can get across, is that we are found and we are loved for exactly who we are. And so I end with this little poem. Beloved friends, here at Harmony Creek Church, no matter who you are, no matter where you've come from, no matter what you carry in your heart, you have a place at this community. You have a place at this table of grace. You know, borrowing words from the song You Will Be Found to remind us, Even when the night feels endless, even when hope feels far away, even when you wonder if you belong, you will be found. And here, when you are found, you are not only welcomed, you are loved, you are known, and you are seen. This is the good news we gather to live into, that God's love meets us exactly where we are and calls us together into a family that's wide enough, strong enough, and tender enough to hold every single one of us. So come as you are with your doubts and your faith, your joy and your sorrow, your questions and your hope. You're not alone. You are found. And here at Harmony Creek Church, you are home. Much love to all of you, my friends.